Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jon Samet, the Dean of the Colorado School of Public Health, parenthesis for a few more months, closing the parenthesis. What a great turnout, weather adjusted. Terrific that we have so many friends and colleagues here. We're, of course, together to celebrate Dr. Steve Berman, our colleague and friend, whose contributions will continue to benefit health everywhere. I want to acknowledge our planning committee, Elaine Berman, Steve Daniels, Molly Lamb, Edwin, Asturias, and myself, along with help from Bobby Ortega in the Dean's office. And I want to thank the team from the Dean's office who've worked hard to make this event happen. I'm going to turn now to our Chancellor, Don Elliman, who's been a strong supporter of the Center for Global Health, who will offer opening remarks. Don.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much. And it's an honor to be here, really, to honor Steve. It's a special tribute, and it's certainly well deserved as we celebrate, what was without doubt an extraordinary life and an extraordinary career. Our campus and our community have been left with a void upon Dr. Steve's passing. His legacy of service, mentorship, and achievement lives on. And for that, we can only be grateful. Throughout his career, Steve impacted so many people here at CU Anschutz, at the Colorado School of Public Health, and far, far beyond the boundaries of this campus. We will have the great fortune of hearing from many colleagues and friends today about all that Steve made possible as a clinician, a researcher, an advocate, a leader, and a mentor. In a moment, I'll turn it back to Jon Samet, but first I'd like to highlight some of the achievements and accomplishments that are on Steve's record, all of which enriched our campus and extended our reach. Dr. Berman joined our faculty in 1978, becoming the youngest section head of general academic pediatrics 3 years later at the ripe old age of 34. He served as professor of pediatrics in the School of Medicine and epidemiology in the Colorado School of Public Health, where he also, as all of you know, led the Colorado Center for Global Health. He held an emeritus endowed chair in academic general pediatrics at Children's Hospital Colorado and was the past president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Steve was a prolific scholar, a beloved educator. He authored hundreds, if not thousands, of texts on pediatric health and mentored probably many people in this room. As a passionate advocate for child health, he spent his career dedicated to advancing pediatric care and health policy at home and abroad. He was a leader, a role model in everything that he did, and a major force for good and an inspiration to many. I know I speak for all of my colleagues on this campus in expressing gratitude for all of Steve's incalculable contributions, and most importantly, the countless lives he touched over the course of a truly exceptional career. Thank you, Steve. Jon.
Thank you, Don. So we're going to hear from 6 speakers who are going to cover the many facets of Steve's career, with Dick Krugman closing with a perspective of looking forward. I'm going to give only brief introductions because I suspect our speakers are well known to many of you in the room. We're going to lead off with Stephen Federico, a pediatrician colleague of Steve Berman's, based at Denver Health. He will address Steve Berman, pediatrician. Steve.
Give me a sound check. I think it sounds okay, Dr. Samet. Dr. Samet, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having us here today. To the Berman family, thank you for including me in this distinguished panel and for honoring Dr. Berman in this way. It is truly an honor to have the opportunity and to be included with all of you panelists. When I was first asked to speak at this memorial, I quickly began to draft an outline. I thought about the outline in the context of all the ways that Steve had influenced me in my career. I drafted notes to myself that read, Steve is a clinician, Steve is a scholar, Steve is a mentor, Steve is a leader, and Steve is an advocate. Then the outline came from Dr. Samet, and I realized that I was going to have to choose from one of those categories. My category is Steve is a pediatrician. To Steve, being a pediatrician meant all of those things, but first and foremost, it meant being a clinician. Steve described caring for patients with complex medical conditions as the most meaningful and enjoyable part of his career. Before he passed, he took the time to document the history of two of his most meaningful clinical programs, the Special Care Clinic and the EB Clinic. Always humble, both histories carefully document the important roles that many colleagues played in the development of those two successful clinical programs. He worked with a team, some of you in this room, that reads like a who's who of Colorado pediatrics to create what became known as the Special Care Clinic to care for children with complex medical conditions. What he left out in this history was just how persistent and dogged he would have to be to establish programs like this one. Thanks to his persistence and leadership, the clinical team grew over the past 25 years to now care for over 6,000 patients who have confusing, difficult medical conditions and whose conditions make it hard to coordinate their care. To paraphrase Steve, the goal of this team since day one was to develop an outstanding comprehensive primary care program for children and families with special healthcare needs, which will achieve at a very high level satisfaction and higher clinical care and lead to improved outcomes and a higher quality of life, while reducing stress and anger associated with the medical system. In constructing the Special Care Clinic, Steve realized the value of bringing multiple disciplines together and specialties to take care of children before multi-specialty clinics existed. Seeing the world through his patient's eyes, Steve realized that this was the future. These strengths came together again in 2001 when he worked to form the multidisciplinary EB Clinic. For those of you who don't know, EB is a debilitating disease that primarily affects the skin and makes it very difficult for patients to eat, sleep, or play. Despite the incredibly skilled nurses and staff at the Children's Hospital, patients with this disease pose significant challenges at every turn, from blood draws to x-rays, from pain management to simple transport. They needed a different champion. In most places, EB is handled by dermatology since the primary organ affected is the skin. However, Steve realized that this was a complex disease that needed dedicated support from all levels. He began to build expertise from every team, from PT to nursing. Always humble, if Steve were here, he would go through the amazing team person by person and describe their contributions. Before he passed, writing that brief history, one of his teammates, Nancy, responded with this to an email to Steve. It is a beautiful story of the art of medicine and nursing at their best, with patients and their families always at the center. EB is not easy, but you bring hope, compassion, and joy into the most difficult of circumstances. Thank you for your tremendous contributions building a support team and system for the patients and those of us who care for them. Thank you for your leadership and your vision. Steve saw patients wholly. In building the EB team, Steve realized that the approach needed to go beyond the hospital bed or the exam room. One example of this was the partnership he made with Denver Public Schools to create a medical day program for these children, to provide them a successful opportunity to attend school and provide them with hope. I came across a quote from Elaine in reviewing that medical day program. To paraphrase Elaine, she says, "In my 2 terms on the Denver Board of Education, one of my favorite activities was attending high school graduations. But there is one graduation I will never forget. Michael's graduation took place at the Children's Hospital. He had a condition, and a debilitating condition called EB that I learned about from my husband, Steve Berman. For me, handing him his diploma was a highlight of my school board service. I met many students and teachers that left an indelible impression on me. but none is more memorable than Michael. Beyond clinical medicine, Steve cared deeply about the history and legacy of the profession of pediatrics. Influenced, no doubt, by the many national leaders in pediatrics from Colorado and from Denver, Steve modeled for us that the profession of pediatrics was about being a clinician who uses their knowledge and credibility to promote child health, and in his case, national health policy. When I first met Steve in 1999, I was an intern and we were making rounds. He wore a pager that was twice as big as the rest of ours. And I asked him about it, and this was before cell phones. And he says, yeah, this is a 1-800 number pager. Anybody in the nation can page me at any time. And it even had letters where he could text back. He was very proud of that pager. And he told me that after rounds, he was getting on a plane to testify in DC. I was instantly starstruck. In 1999, he ran against Dr. Cal Sai from Hawaii for the presidency of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The fact that Dr. Sai was his opponent was important because Dr. Sai championed the concept of medical home, something that was very important to Steve. Always gracious following his win, he said of Dr. Sai, I wish that Cal and I could have won together. I feel like we campaigned together. Steve was very proud of the fact that he was a Colorado National AAP president on the heels of Dr. Cook, which meant that we had 2 back-to-back AAP presidents. Steve's path to AAP leadership went through the Colorado chapter and the extremely influential Committee on Child Health Financing, or COFCA. Through this committee, he played a major part in the national discussion regarding the financing of child health, including Medicaid, pushing for universal payment system for children, and of course, the creation of CHIP. He once told me that as AAP president, he was really given one issue that he could lead on and truly lead the academy on. And his was a concept known as Medikids. Steve viewed this as Steve was very successful in pushing the CHIP program, and he viewed this as a stepping stone towards universal coverage for kids that he would later call Medicaid. It would be another 11 years before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which admittingly still was not where Steve wanted us to be. However, it was a giant step forward in the provision of health coverage, and it was made partly possible by the foundation of his work in the 90s and early 2000s as president of the AAP. Here in Colorado, Steve also remained active in the Colorado chapter. He was a leader of the legislative committee for many years, offering his wisdom and insight on state issues and state bills. He testified regularly on committees that many of you in this room were part of. And of course, he spearheaded on all issues related to health coverage. His Colorado advocacy went beyond the chapter as he helped to start multiple community and advocacy organizations, such as Bright Beginnings and the Colorado Children's Campaign. In so doing, he showed his focus on the tangible needs of children, be they healthcare, education, community resources, or social needs. Steve thought deeply about systemic and sustainable ways to promote change. His advocacy and policy work were consistently informed through the lens of a clinician. He remarked regularly that it was crucial to remain grounded in his clinical work and to remain active as a clinician, something he learned from his mentor, Dr. Kempe. As I drafted those remarks, it was hard for me to stay in one single pediatric lane, not only because Steve did not approach pediatrics in this way, but also because he thought of himself as a pediatrician always and everywhere. There's a story in one of his books when he was waiting to lobby a congressperson in DC. And while waiting, the wife of the congressman was in the waiting room. Elaine, you know this story. And she approached him and found out that he was a pediatrician and asked him a story about their child who was suffering from soiling or encoparesis. And so Steve offered some clinical advice. And he says this in his book, I was always a clinician. I was always on call. So I needed to help this mom. He went in and spoke to the congressman and went home. And weeks later, he got a note from the wife from the mom that said, thank you so much. Your clinical advice was spot on. Our child is doing so much better. A few days later, he got a note from the congressman's staff that said, anything you want to do with the bill, carte blanche, go for it. So I had to work hard not to bleed those topics together because, as you can see, to Steve, they weren't separate. He was a profound influence on me, teaching me that as a pediatrician, one must be a clinician, an advocate, a scholar, a mentor, a leader. but above all, always the voice for children. Steve and Elaine have been so kind over the years to many of us. They regularly opened their home and offered their hospitality, their wisdom, their connections, and their vision for children. Thank you both.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we'll turn to Allison Kempe, a pediatrician and consummate health services researcher and director of records. Allie. Okay.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'm so proud to be part of this group. It is an honor to speak about Steve. I want to echo what Steve just said about having a very tough time talking about only one part of Steve. His roles as a mentor, clinician, advocate, researcher, they were all so tightly enmeshed that it's very hard to focus on one thing. But I'm going to talk about research. I first met Steve when he came to our house to draw my father's blood. I was in medical school at the time. My father was the chairman of pediatrics, and Steve was a very junior attending. But my father said he was the only one who was allowed to draw his blood. So I knew immediately this was a very powerful, very special person. And he became my division head when I moved from Boston to join the General Academic Pediatric Division. I'm going to tell you about two projects that Steve involved me in that are examples of, first of all, how the research questions he posed were often so novel that posing them in itself was a catalyst for change. And secondly, how he was able to so effectively and rapidly use evidence he generated to guide policy and change practice. Steve got a CDC grant in the second half of the 1990s. Some of you may have been involved, called the Colorado Rural Immunization Services Project, or CRISP, with the purpose of developing a regional immunization registry that included data from all private and public providers in two very large regions of Colorado. This was really novel at the time. Although some registries existed in big cities, no one had really tried to bring together the multiple rural-urban sections. Steve could see clearly that unless we could measure immunization rates at the population level, we could not improve them. And at the time, Colorado had a very long way to go. We still do have a way to go. This effort became the underpinning of the Colorado Immunization Information System, or CIS, which is now one of the most complete registries in the country, and one that has continued to be at the forefront of innovative research to increase immunization rates. For example, the use of an IIS to conduct population-based centralized reminder recall, the use of populating the IIS with vital statistics, so that you could see infants that had not yet received any immunizations by 6 months and target interventions. So a lot of very innovative ways of using the registry. It was crucial, Steve understood, to monitor immunization rates at the population level in order to force those who made policy to pay attention. The second example has to deal with Steve's involvement at the forefront of establishing and researching the impact of insurance coverage for children and families that did not qualify for Medicaid. A full 7 years before the passage of the federal legislation that established the State Child Health Insurance Program, or SCHIP, Steve, working closely with Elaine, established a state-funded program that was called the Colorado Child Health Plan, or CCHP. Because of this program, when SCHIP was finally passed at the federal level, Colorado was so far ahead of other states that it became the first to receive federal funding from SCHIP. known going forward as and now as CHP+. But Steve could see that it wasn't enough just to advocate for the creation of such programs. He knew that he needed rigorous evaluation data to garner continued support for this program. Steve and I were able to get multiple grants to evaluate various aspects of CHP+, including reasons for enrolling, reasons for disenrolling, how the program was affecting child health outcomes, and most importantly, how it was affecting unmet child needs, medical needs. Steve then took our data directly to the state legislature and effectively testified for refunding of the program, not just once, but repeatedly. These are only two examples of many research efforts that both spurred change in practice and provided evidence to guide policy. Steve's research spans so many different areas. He was, in fact, sort of the poster child for ignoring the adage that many of us give our trainees that they need to focus, focus, focus in one area. He simply would not do it. Wherever he saw the need in his clinical or policy work to solve a problem, that's where his research would take him. Optimal treatment of otitis media and chronic middle ear effusion, management of acute respiratory infection in low-income, low-resource countries, vaccine supply, vaccine financing, and reimbursement issues in the US and globally. Optimal healthcare delivery for children with special healthcare needs, effects of differing insurance on childhood outcomes, and how to incentivize physicians to care for Medicaid insured children, methods of increasing early language development and for decreasing disparities in early language development. I could go on and on. Steve's research was always one step ahead of the curve. His motivation to do research was to solve problems, and he was a very successful fixer in the non-mafia sense. Steve also understood the importance of collaborating with others in research and the need to have infrastructure to support collaborative research. He created the Children's Outcomes Research Program, or CORE, a program that fostered development of health services and outcomes research in the Department of Pediatrics and at Children's Hospital. And I was lucky enough to be there to assist him with that program. Eventually, CORE and the adult-focused Colorado Health Outcomes programs were united and over time grew enormously. The Accord Center that I now direct had its origins in Steve and John Steiner's efforts to focus on pragmatic science with direct implications for policy and practice. Accords now supports hundreds of investigators throughout the School of Medicine who are focusing on pragmatic science. Therefore, to me, Steve's legacy includes all of these investigators and their work. In addition, the growth of these programs, I believe, has produced a real culture change at this university, which is beginning to recognize the importance and rigor of pragmatic science. Finally, in his research, he took advantage of every opportunity to support the research careers and support every part of junior faculty around him. His MO was to invite a junior faculty member to become involved in a research project, support them to success, and then seamlessly transition them into being in charge. I suspect that many faculty members, maybe in this audience, didn't realize how much Steve helped them because he did it very stealthily often. It was not about ego for him. For me, it was only in retrospect that I understood how much he influenced my career, especially how he positioned me for a leadership position in research. I am so grateful to have known Steve. For me, he was an inspiring mentor, a generous colleague, and a beloved friend. May his memory be a blessing.
Okay, thank you so much, Ali. And next we'll move on to Cody Belzley, a longtime advocate for child health and a member of the advisory board for the Colorado School of Public Health. Cody.
Good afternoon. It's a nice introduction, John. I prefer to think of myself just though as a policy nerd who has spent the last 20 years working on state and local efforts to make Colorado a great place to be a kid. And as a result, I've had a chance to work alongside of and learn from Elaine and Steve Berman throughout my career. It's an honor to join you all today and to share some reflections on the incredible impact that Steve made as a policy advocate. My favorite memory of Steve is from 2004. At that time, Colorado's state tax on cigarettes and other tobacco products was the lowest in the country, lower even than North Carolina, Kentucky, and other tobacco-producing states. Health advocates were getting ready to put a proposal on the ballot to increase that tobacco tax and direct revenue to public health programs. But first, we needed to raise awareness about Colorado's low tax rate. I will remind you that the world was a pretty different place in 2004. In fact, it was 2004 that a Harvard sophomore named Mark Zuckerberg created an internet-based messaging platform for his college buddies that he called Facebook. George W. Bush was president of the United States, and Republicans controlled both chambers of the Colorado State Legislature and the governor's office. Denver had 2 thriving daily newspapers and a downtown that was safe, vibrant, and bustling. So given that context, we had to come up with a plan to earn our media attention for this campaign. And to do so, we decided to host a march down the middle of the 16th Street Mall during a busy work week, and we invited the TV stations and the newspapers to come cover the event. I was 23 years old at the time and working as a junior associate at a local political consulting firm. I was essentially a half step above an intern. And as such, I was voluntold that I needed to dress up in a ridiculous, hot, and awkward human-sized cigarette costume and effectively serve as the mascot for this political endeavor. As we were lining up at the end of the 16th Street Mall and getting ready to make our march, it became evident that I couldn't see out of the cigarette costume and that this was lining up to be a dangerous endeavor. So Steve came over quietly and gently took my arm and guided me the mile or so down the 16th Street Mall, narrating the scene around us and telling me jokes and keeping my spirits high. Here was an incredibly accomplished and respected physician leader doing the helpful but not at all glamorous work of helping to keep the junior staffer in the cigarette costume upright and moving forward. That, to me, was Steve Berman in a nutshell. Kind, caring, and thoughtful, committed to the cause, and never too important to do what was needed to advance the work. With Steve's continued involvement and leadership on that campaign, which was known as Amendment 35, we passed that tax increase with 61% voter support and have since generated well over $1 billion of public revenue to fund Medicaid services, support safety net clinics, and expand public health programs in Colorado. The amazing part, though, is that the Amendment 35 success story may not even make the top 10 list of Steve Berman's policy contributions. He was prolific in his advocacy work, and the resulting impact is truly remarkable. In addition to the thousands of kids who benefited from direct patient care they received from Dr. Berman, there are millions of kids, I'd venture to say tens of millions of kids, who've never met Steve and yet benefited from his commitment and his tenacity. Kids whose moms got prenatal care and a safe delivery thanks to Medicaid. Kids who received insurance thanks to CHIP. Kids who got a vaccine thanks to a reminder recall generated by an immunization registry. And kids whose lives were saved thanks to mandatory seatbelt and bike helmet laws that Steve made possible. What a legacy to make population change and improve the lives of tens of millions of children. But as I think of Steve's legacy, for me, it's not so much about what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it that is so inspirational and instructive. First and foremost, Steve was in this work for the right reasons. As we all know, lots of people, too many people, get into politics to feed an ego or to advance an ideology, but not Steve. He believed wholeheartedly and sincerely in the importance of using public policy to solve problems and create opportunity. Despite the frustrations and challenges of the democratic process, Steve remained optimistic that change was possible and that those of us with privilege and power have a responsibility to use it for the benefit of those without. Throughout his career, his advocacy focused on giving a voice to children who literally have no voice in the political process. More recently, he dedicated himself to tackling poverty by addressing the structural policies that prohibit economic mobility in our society. At the end of his life, Steve and I served together on the board of the Bell Policy Center, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing economic mobility. And just a couple of weeks before his death, Steve co-authored an opinion column in the Denver Post with our fellow board member, Angela Cobian, about the urgent need to fix Colorado's regressive tax policies that lock people in poverty and grow the wealth gap. To the very end, Steve lived the courage of his convictions and optimistically pursued justice. Second, Steve was persistent, relentless even in his pursuit of policy change, but he was also always respectful, good-humored, and gracious. A happy warrior of sorts, Steve was firm in his belief, but gentle in his interactions, willing to disagree, but never disagreeable. Steve and Elaine, together with Anna Jo Haynes, Nancy and Sam Gary, and Dr. Paul Milinkovich, founded the Colorado Children's Campaign, which today is the state's leading nonprofit child advocacy organization. They believe that kids' issues shouldn't be partisan issues, and they work to build strategic alliances based on shared values. They also knew that in order to thrive, kids needed to grow up healthy, but that they also needed quality childcare and a great education. Steve and the Children's Campaign's co-founders never sought to pit these interests against each other, but instead to look for shared successes. They understood that some legislators who were not on board with public health insurance programs were tremendous advocates for education and childcare, and that Colorado's kids needed those legislators on one, if not all three of those issues. As a result, the Children's Campaign for decades now has built a big tent and has sought to find common ground with Republicans and Democrats alike and to build bridges between education, health, and early childhood development. The organization's commitment to bipartisanship, to advancing data-driven policy, and to building strategic alliances reflects Steve and his colleagues' personal philosophies and approaches, which have proven to both be strategic and the right thing to do. Third, and finally, Steve understood that you don't make systems change alone. Advocacy is a team sport. And throughout his life, Steve played just about every position on Team Kids. He developed the game plans, recruited the talent, shot the baskets, raised the money, provided the pep talks, and even hosted the victory celebrations. For many community-based nonprofits, including the Bell and the Children's Campaign that I've already mentioned, but also Bright by 3, which is now Bright by Text, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, Steve was a star player, a coach, a cheerleader, and a business manager. His versatility and his willingness to take on whatever role was needed made him an MVP of the children's advocacy movement in Colorado and nationally for more than 4 decades. I know that many of you, like me, loved playing on Steve's team, and we will be forever shaped by the experience. At the risk of taking the sports analogy too far, I'd be remiss not to point out that Steve's best teammate in the advocacy work, his MVP, was clearly Elaine. Their shared values, their unwavering commitment to community service, and their love and support of one another was evident in everything they did, and we are all better off for it. Sadly, Our politics today is deeply broken. Too much pessimism, too much division, too much ego and ideology, and too much tearing each other down. The world needs more Steve Bermans, more optimism and unity, more focus on social justice and the common good, more good humor and graciousness, and more teamwork. So as we celebrate Steve today, let's also commit to continue his work of creating opportunity and doing so with the same relentless commitment and kindness that he did. And in doing so, his memory will be a blessing.
Thank you so much, Cody. We'll remember your charge. Now to move on to Edwin Asturias, pediatrician, Steve's long-term colleague at the Center for Global Health and leader of the outstanding center in Guatemala. Edwin.
So, how do you define a champion, especially a global health champion? A champion is someone who can transform the fear, doubts, and challenges and keep things in perspective and produce extraordinary results for people around the world. To be a champion, you need several key qualities: courage, perseverance, belief in mission, compassion, sacrifice, integrity, and respect. Steve Berman was well suited to become a global health champion from the start of his pediatric career. Now, there is a secret to that recipe that can seal this excellence. You must pair with the right partner, one that will distill your essence and motivate you to dream of the impossible. In 1976, after completing his residency, Steve and Elaine moved to Cali, a hot, humid town in the Pacific coast of Colombia. Through hard clinical work and his constant probe of how to alleviate children's suffering, he started to generate his seminal research on the etiology of pneumonia and ear infections. Soon after, Steve was leading the pneumonia studies at the World Health Organization, improving our understanding of what viruses and bacteria made children sick and breathless worldwide. During the next 2 decades, Steve returned to Colorado to lead the Division of Academic General Pediatrics, started with Elaine the Colorado Children's Campaign, became president of the Academy of Pediatrics, and fought relentlessly for children's health care, as you have heard. Yet, he never forgot his commitment to children living in harsh environments in other countries. As if he did not have enough to do, he helped develop and disseminate a course on pediatric disaster preparedness to more than 30 countries. What made Steve someone exceptional at his job in global health was his willingness to go where need was, to extend his hand to friends and mentees, to make a difference by acting and not just advising. He knew the power of experiencing people's struggles firsthand, of learning and understanding the hard life of others so he could become their voice, and to gather people and teach us about the hardships and unleash the change rooted in experience and collaboration. So in his last 12 years, Steve took the ultimate challenge. He catapulted the Center for Global Health, back then with a limited footprint in Africa, and turned it into a magnet for transformative global health practice. He knew well that mission trips, isolated research, and conferences, while noble and briefly important, were not the solution, not the model needed to improve the health of people around the world. He embraced the idea of creating 3 signature sites where the university and Children's Hospital will take our knowledge and power in research, education, service, and advocacy, and build capacity to improve the lives of families and children where it's most needed. The first of these sites established in the southwest rural lowlands of Guatemala in 2011, and pictured here, has now brought close to 10 million in research grants, trained more than 100 local health nurses, lab technicians, and doctors, and serves as a model for global health education for our residents and students. However, the key fact is that not only the site has become an example of participatory global health, but Steve made sure that our prototype was sustainable, collective, and able to empower local partners to slowly become actors to change their own reality. Once again, the always perseverant and compassionate Steve, during the past decade, was able to create a bidirectional global health program, whether teaching and learning pediatric disasters education in Colorado, Africa, or Asia, or implementing finger puppets for child development in China or Guatemala, or the maternal child nurse-based model in rural Trifino. He knew that our work in other countries made us better pediatricians, better public health officials, family practitioners, and most important, better advocates. The past 3 years, the world experienced one of the worst challenges to human health in the century. During this time, Steve never stopped thinking about how he could help others. He unleashed the capacities of our faculty to serve during the pandemic and supported our work while becoming a tireless advocate for equity and speaking against nationalism. In 2020, when the Trump administration cut ties with the World Health Organization, he warned of the dangers of walking away from our long-standing commitments to the world's most vulnerable mothers and children and the backlash for the future of global health security. In 2021, as the rollout of vaccines became inequitable, he wrote again that no country will be safe from the pandemic until the rapid spread is stopped everywhere, especially in large countries living in poverty. As we witness, Steve, our champion in global health, has left us with a clear and long-standing vision for this campus and the state. For as much as we have attained in science and healthcare excellence here in Colorado, becoming the shining light for health at the top of the Rocky Mountains, our duty is to ensure that this bright reflection extends to the most vulnerable in need from afar. Steve started us on our way, but there's still much to be done, and we should and will continue to carry out his legacy, to learn from others, and to then help them transform their lives for a better world.
Thank you, Edwin.
Still more?
Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Oh, okay, good. All right, our next presentation is virtual. You're going to click. Is virtual. We're going to hear from Mark Earnest, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Mark, of course, is an internist, snuck one in, and head of general internal medicine, someone who is, again, influenced by Steve early in his career and ongoing. So he'll be talking about Steve Berman, leader and teacher and mentor.
I'd like to start with sending my best wishes to Elaine, Seth, and Ben. I wish I could be there with you in person today. I regret that I can't, but I'm with you in spirit. I want you to notice I pulled out one of my few bow ties for the occasion, and as you can see, I could have used a little help tying it, but it seemed appropriate. For the rest of you who may not know me, my name is Mark Earnest, and I need to start with a confession. I'm an internist. I take care of grown-ups. I think Steve sometimes considered me a pediatrician that somehow had just lost his way, but those are the facts. I'm an internist. And I share that because my task here today is to talk about Steve as a teacher and a mentor. I'm not a pediatrician. Steve taught and mentored a lot of pediatricians, and he's incredibly well known as a teacher and a mentor to pediatricians. The truth is I never sat in a classroom where Steve was teaching. I never made rounds with Steve as a teaching attending. And despite all of this, I feel very well qualified to talk about Steve as a teacher and a mentor. I met Steve almost 30 years ago at the old campus, the old University of Colorado Hospital on 9th and Colorado. And at the moment when we met, I was literally the most junior member of the Department of Medicine. I was just a few months out of residency, and Steve showed up one day on my schedule as a new patient. He came for a preventive visit and to establish care with me. So let me pause there and just note how remarkable that is. Steps away from us at that moment were easily a half dozen more senior, well-known, distinguished physicians, and he could have made the choice and picked any of them to establish care, but he didn't. He signed up for the rookie, and I'm very fortunate that he did. But that choice to me demonstrates how much Steve believed in the enterprise he was part of. He believed in education. He believed the medical schools and the training programs we run create trustworthy results. It meant a lot to me that he placed his trust in me. I don't remember much detail about that first visit. I'm pretty sure Steve asked me more questions than I managed to ask him. And mind you, these weren't questions to judge my competence, but they were questions intended to learn who I was. It was the first of many conversations I'd have with Steve over the decades that followed. And the relationship we developed over those years was unlike any other I've ever had. He was my patient first, but in short order, he became a friend, a teacher, a mentor, and a role model. Shortly after our first meeting, the American health system went through a massive upheaval. The Clintons had just taken the White House, and the plan that they'd put in place, which promised to deliver universal health coverage, collapsed. It was replaced not by a comprehensive coverage plan, but by a business scheme called managed care. It was the moment that the corporatization of our healthcare system started, and that continues today. Locally, the results were swift and, at least for me, incredibly distressing. For-profit companies swooped into Denver and bought up what had been nonprofit community hospitals, and then they rapidly began squeezing the waste out of the system. Most of what they called waste consisted of people who didn't have health insurance. Insurance companies ratcheted down their reimbursement rates that defrayed the cost of taking care of the uninsured, and a number of hospitals just stopped caring for people who didn't have insurance. And the result was that, at least for grown-ups, I'll leave children's out of this, there were only 2 hospitals in Denver that made any effort to see the uninsured: Denver Health and University Hospital. The results were predictable. Both the hospitals were quickly inundated. University Hospital was soon in the red and began to institute a series of policies to staunch the bleeding. And for me, as a young physician, it meant that there were patients who I either could no longer care for, or for whom the care I could deliver was very limited. It was incredibly distressing, and I felt like I needed to do something, but I had absolutely no idea what. I thought pretty seriously about leaving my job at the university and taking a job at a safety net institution, because it didn't seem like there was a place in academic medicine to do the things I felt like needed to be done. More than anyone else, Steve was a person who convinced me I was wrong about that. For lack of a better term, I'll call it Steve's geography lesson. I had been taught rather explicitly that medicine occupied a very narrow geography. Physicians belonged at the bedside or in an exam room, but not in the community, not at the State House. Steve, of course, would have none of that. He believed the geography of medicine was global and was limited only by the imagination and by one's willingness to persist. I'll spare you all the details, but largely because of Steve's encouragement, I stayed at the university and gradually shifted the focus of my career from becoming a researcher to finding some solutions to the access crisis I found myself in. I became involved in a statewide coalition dedicated to expanding health insurance to everyone in the state. There were a lot of people who told me I was making a big mistake. They told me I was wasting my time or putting my career at risk, and my boss at the time was one of those people. But Steve was not. He encouraged me to get even more involved. The academic part, he reassured me, would work out just fine. And the best evidence I had for that was actually Steve himself. Things seemed to have worked out well for him, and that fact, along with his reassurances, were enough to put my fears aside. Around that time, I had the good fortune of being accepted to an advocacy fellowship with the Open Society Institute. It was an incredible opportunity for me. I got to work half-time with the coalition for a couple of years, and that was when things really took off. I had the time to really pour myself into the work, and I got to see and know a part of the world that had been hidden from me. Steve was my coach. Every time we talked, he would quiz me about what I was working on, and I'd always leave those conversations with a whole list of new ideas, as well as contact information for people to connect with. It was during those years that I learned that Steve Berman knew literally everyone, and that an introduction from Steve opened a whole lot of doors. As my fellowship drew to an end, I was trying to figure out how to continue to do the advocacy work that I'd fallen in love with, and how to translate all that I'd learned into something of value in academic medicine. I was fortunate at the time to have gotten to know a couple of other Steve Berman mentees, Shale Wong and Steve Federico, and we began batting around an idea. What if, rather than leaving it to chance, medical schools set out to intentionally create the next Steve Berman? What would that look like? To answer that question, we went straight to the source. We scheduled a series of meetings with Steve to brainstorm and sketch out what it might look like. Steve insisted that the most important part of creating an advocate was providing someone with a real, authentic opportunity to do something meaningful. If you can provide them with just a taste of it, they'll be hooked. That was what Steve said. So we started with that at the core. We wanted to create a program within the medical school to foster future advocates and leaders. Each year, we would recruit a new cohort of students to join the program. Within the program, each student would spend 2 months working on an advocacy project, mentored within a nonprofit organization. We wanted to expose them to mentors and role models like Steve that would inspire them and provide them some templates for what they could do with their careers beyond the exam room. And finally, we sketched out a curriculum to go along with it all. That conversation, literally sketched out on the back of an envelope, became the LEADS program. We wrote it up into a grant, and within a year, we had the funding we needed to start it. It was the first time, to my knowledge, that any medical school in the world planted a flag and said, we are going to train our students to be leaders and advocates, and set out to concretely outline what that would look like. Within a year, we got our first grant, and we launched the program. It was funded with extramural grants for more than a decade. We had a really steep learning curve and a lot of trial and error, but the program grew steadily. One of the keys to our successes was the partnerships we developed with several community-based organizations. Our first summer, we partnered with maybe a half dozen, and it seemed like for most of them, Steve had either helped found them or served on their board. And if it wasn't Steve who founded them or on the board, it was Elaine. The LEADS program ended just a couple of years ago. It ended not because it ran out of money or it ran out of interest, but because the School of Medicine absorbed most of the program's content into the curriculum. So if you want to know what it would look like if a medical school set out to create a whole generation of Steve Bermans, you just have to look at the current curriculum of the University of Colorado. That idea that physicians should be advocates was way out on the fringes when we started LEADS. Pediatrics was ahead of medicine in that regard. 20 years ago, we managed to sneak a workshop on advocacy into the national meeting for the Society for General Internal Medicine. It was the first time the word advocacy appeared in the meeting's program. 2 years ago, the theme of the entire meeting was advocacy. How's that for legacy? So what does all that have to do with teaching and mentorship? The best teachers inspire. They enable their learners to discover who they are and who they could be. Perhaps more importantly, they help their learners wrestle with and ultimately answer the more important question: who should they be? Good teachers transmit knowledge and skills. They change attitudes. Great teachers transmit courage. Steve Berman was a great teacher.
That was terrific. So we'll move now to Dick Krugman, of course, former Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs and Dean of the School of Medicine and a supporter of Steve. Dick.
I just got a text from Steve. He said, lighten it up. Trust me, it's right here. Elaine, Ben, Seth, and all of you. Before I look forward, I need to look back. I actually was looking at that picture, sitting right there, Steve looking down with that smile. And I was trying to figure out, was that the smile that he gave us when he wanted something? Because I saw that smile a lot when I became dean. Or was it the smile when he was happy we didn't screw up in the clinic when he was first put in charge in the 70s? And the night went well. It could have been. But what I really remembered when I started thinking of this was I think I first met him when I was chief resident of PEDS in 1971, and he was interviewing out here before the matching plan. I remember him as a very tall, gangly, very hairy guy from Philadelphia. But one would have thought he needed a haircut, except we all looked like that at that time. We looked okay. He did match here, and he came the week before I left for my 2 years of service, sort of service. It was NIH. And in 73, I returned to the faculty and as an assistant professor, but I was asked to be chief resident again because the program had expanded from 2 years to 3 years. And because they had to fund 3 years of residence, there were no longer chief residents. So I got to repeat my chief resident year with a group of incredibly angry residents who had been told they were coming into a 2-year program, but got 3, which meant more night call and other things. I do remember that Steve took it reasonably well, as he took whatever some people thought were setbacks. He wasn't really angry. From his perspective, it was an opportunity to learn more and to be a better pediatrician. In the decade of the 80s, he oversaw the child health clinic. And I had one of the half-day-a-week pediatric group practices there and often asked him for advice. When he got too busy with advocacy, he recruited on shifts so that there was always somebody who knew what was going on. But one day there was a baby he was worried about. And in the 80s, I happened to be the pediatrician on the child protection team. And he said he was worried about this mother and this baby. And what did I think about going with him on a home visit? I said, fine, that's good. We'll see it was right over here in Aurora, just north of Colfax, somewhere around Moline. And you know you're in a little bit of trouble when you don't have to knock on the door because the door has been broken in and broken down. It was the second floor apartment north of Colfax. We reached the second floor and instantly had the feeling we shouldn't be there. It was hard to knock on the door because it had been splintered by the gentleman, not really, who was holding a gun pointed toward the door at the two of us. That made it easy to see inside when the door was knocked down, by the way. And the mother's boyfriend made it clear that he was not interested in having either of us there to examine his baby. We both learned a lot about that experience. Neither of us told our wives, right? You didn't know about this. And I certainly didn't tell ours, but that was the last home visit we made together as a group. And I learned how to use law enforcement and child protective services to make those visits. Steve's 5-decade career in pediatrics, which he recounted to us in a grand rounds, and a lot of my colleagues here have recounted here, had so many interests locally, statewide, nationally, internationally, and he followed them all to his positive outcomes, and he was just stunningly global in his approach, while never forgetting Henry Kemp's mantra to never stop caring for the individual children and their families. Only Elaine, Seth, and Ben can tell us if he ever wasn't working on something? Did he actually ever take a break and not do something in the long series of extraordinary outcomes that he was part of? Not that any of us on the faculty who he has mentored should be expected to emulate all of it, but it is a model for how to take on very different challenges at different stages of one's career. There was a decade of this, a decade of the next, and the next, and the next. And that leads me, I think, to my final observation about Steve and the timeliness of his last lesson. Steve's health issues over the years were well known to his friends and colleagues. He obviously didn't give a damn about HIPAA because he sent emails to everyone outlining what was going on with his illnesses. We shared the ups and downs of his cardiac issues and his stents, and happily, well, maybe grudgingly, accepted his pescatarian diet over the last 20 years when we went out to dinner with him. Some of us were really longing for a steak, but we learned to love fish, and I still want to know what our mercury levels were. Then, toward the end, came the ups and downs of the T cells and the B cells of the past year. And then the call came on Saturday, January 7th, that Steve wanted to see Doug Jones and me that afternoon at the hospital to say goodbye. He had made up his mind that he was ready for the next step. As usual, there was no dissuading him. He had thought it through, and he wanted us to know how much our friendship had meant to him and how he appreciated how we had supported him during his career as friends and colleagues, and that he was ready to move on. 10 days later, he did move on. And just as he helped all of us with pediatric decision-making in that classic text he wrote, he helped many of us, and particularly recently me, with end-of-life decision-making, something I needed 10 weeks later. So if you want to know how to look forward from these experiences, there are a couple of lessons for those of you who are much younger than most of you who are in this room, because for most of us in this room, it may be a little late. The first lesson in looking forward is do your best to have a supportive spouse. It really does help. Stay in one place if you can. That's something that many younger generations either have forgotten or haven't figured it out yet. And as both Steve's mentor and many of our mentors said, don't think it hasn't been fun. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick, and thanks to all our speakers and to everyone here. I just have a few things. I want to share with you how Steve's friends and colleagues have come together in a collective effort and raised enough to establish a distinguished professorship in Steve's name. This professorship will help realize Steve's vision for the Center for Global Health and help it to continue on its trajectory of becoming one of the world's leading global health programs. This effort is continuing to raise funds and gaining momentum towards a full chair. There is a crowdfunding site that we sent out via email about this, along with other information. So we're hopeful that we'll reach our goal in the near future. We will achieve a chair in honor of Steve Berman. Clearly, he has left many other legacies. So in terms of this afternoon and what comes next, we have a reception outside, an opportunity to mingle. I know that many of you may want to talk about Steve and share reminiscences with your colleagues. The room is actually set up so you can come back in and talk and perhaps after about 15 minutes of grabbing food for those who want to make comments about Steve through a microphone and talk to the group. That opportunity will be here. I will say I came to the Colorado School of Public Health in 2017. Steve, of course, had reached out to me long before I came to make sure that he was training me to do what he wanted, that I would do what he wanted me to do. I was savvy enough to figure out what was going on, and we shared goals. We shared goals around global health. We shared goals around public health, and we shared goals around how a school of public health should make a difference, and a collective vision of having a multidisciplinary center like the Center for Global Health that brought people together from different disciplines to learn and to make a difference in Guatemala and make a difference elsewhere. So Steve and I think will say, resonated in a shared set of values. And I enjoyed my time working with Steve. To Dick, I recognized that smile when he came into the office. And I was always trying to make sure I understood what the agenda was, sometimes involving my wallet, if you will, and sometimes to engage me in important activities. So I think as a bottom line, we'll all miss Steve. So let's end here. Thank you so much to Steve. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. To Elaine, our organizers, and let's go continue talking.